You're listening to Fast Facts Perio Edition. And now, here's your host, Katrina Sanders.
Hello, and welcome to Fast Facts Perio Edition. This week, I'm feeling real guilty about the fact that my mother had 4 childbirth experiences. That's right. Katrina Sanders is the oldest of 4 in the Sanders family. And interestingly enough, our research this week comes from a Korean study looking at over 10,000 women who experienced varying levels of childbirths and in some cases abortions and miscarriages. And what they wanted to do after an oral examination, looking at things like exclusive factors of daily toothbrushing frequency, hygiene products, etc., was to look at the association between birth-related variables and periodontitis. Okay, so we understand that if a patient is pregnant and they have oral inflammation or periodontitis, that these patients have an elevated risk of experiencing the complications of potential preterm or low birth weight delivery, which we know occurs in about 1 in 10 deliveries across the United States. We've looked at the data. We understand that it's a combination of the pathogens and some of the inflammatory cytokines, particularly those prostaglandins, which are in high concentrations in periodontitis and also will stimulate labor. So we understand those links, and that's been well tracked inside of our data. But this research study takes it another step forward. So in this research study, it looked at the odds ratio or the link of periodontitis, particularly severe periodontitis, based on the number of childbirths. And this study concluded that the number of childbirths is associated with the severity of periodontitis. So perhaps that age-old concept of, well, my child when I was pregnant took all of these nutrients from me, my teeth became weak, my body started to change. Perhaps there is something to that after all. Looking inside of this particular research study, it looked at how childbirth is going to impact the resilience, the immune system of the body, and we begin to see that tracked trend. Interestingly enough, this relationship, the relationship of periodontitis inside of birth-related variables, was not seen to be significant for the number of abortions and miscarriages, which means to say that if a pregnant woman experiences high concentrations of abortions or miscarriages, it does not necessarily mean that there is an increased severity of periodontitis. But this is where we're starting to look at some of these risk profiles. If a woman is experiencing multiple childbirths, and I'm thinking about so many of you who say, "Oh, I'm 1 in 10 in my family," or "I'm 1 in..." My grandmother, you guys, was number 13 of 16 children. If you can even for a moment think about what that would look like. Grandma and grandpa were quite busy. But what I do mean to say is when you see these large families, that the number of childbirths are linked to that severity of periodontitis. Now, let's take a look at how this shows up inside of our clinical care. Now, we recognize that childbirth trends have been ebbing and flowing. In fact, childbirth trends, particularly across the United States, has been shifting quite a bit. We know, for example, that in the pre-pandemic era, that we began to see changes in a decline. That current birth rate was slowing down, and we believe that that had a lot to do with societal trends of millennials being quite focused on careers and fertility rates also being areas of concern. Those stats have been well published with the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. And then the pandemic happened. And although those birth rates had begun to drop as women were waiting to have babies and things like that, something about the shutdown of the pandemic and the stay-at-home orders began to demonstrate a new increase or a resurgence in birth rates. And so women delivering births to these COVID babies, we began to see a tiny little baby boom, so to speak. However, new data coming down as early as the early portion of 2023 are actually providing data pieces noting that U.S. birth rates are now down again after the COVID baby bust, they're calling it. So when we look at some of these trends, and I do believe that many of us have seen an increase in our female patient population experiencing pregnancies, that this certainly could be indicators for an upward trend of periodontal diseases in some of our patient populations. Nevertheless, this certainly provides us with reason to believe that as we begin to see shifts and changes in birth rates across the United States, as patients continue to grow their families, that this becomes a really critical piece of data to share with our patients. That as we're beginning to study the ways in which the body responds during pregnancy to certain types of inflammations, infections, and the presence of bacteria, that we now understand, or we now know that with an increased number of pregnancies, that periodontal disease is another one of those conditions that a pregnant mother puts herself at risk for. So the goal inside of identifying data pieces like this is simply to change that narrative or that conversation, helping our patients to understand that it is possible after you've given birth to the second, the third, the fourth, the fifth, or in my great-grandmother's case, the 16th, that there is an elevated risk associated not just with periodontitis, but an acceleration in the severity of periodontitis in these cases. This has been another episode of Fast Facts, Perio Edition with Katrina Sanders. Please feel free to reach me on Instagram at The Dental Wine Genist or on my website, www.katrinasanders.com. Cheers.